Hello, I'm David R. Jones of the Community Service Society. New York City's crisis in affordable housing shows no sign of easing. What to do is our topic next on the Urban Agenda. Joining me now are City Council member Gale Brewer, whose Manhattan district includes the neighborhoods of the Upper West Side and Clinton, and Kim Hardy, Deputy Commissioner of Community Partnerships at the New York City Department of Housing and Development. Welcome to the Urban Agenda.
Thank you for having me.
Gale, okay, what does housing look like from your vantage point on the City Council?
Well, there are two crises. There are so many. You're right about the affordable crises.
Right.
On the west side, we're concerned about preservation because we can't build necessarily new, although we're very interested in the 65,000 person plan that the mayor has proposed.
Right.
So we're concerned about the fact that with the rent stabilization challenges, rent guidelines board, increase in rents, will that drive people out? And what can we do to preserve those units that we have? We'd like to change the way in which the rent stabilization exists. Right now, of course, if you make a certain amount and if you have an apartment that goes $2,000 or more, you can, in fact, be involved in a vacancy decontrol situation. So we're trying very hard to keep the rent guidelines board increases down. We're going to be fighting about that in June.
Oh, that's not a foregone conclusion?
No, we're still going to be fighting there, David.
Right.
And then, of course, in terms of I'm sure that Kim will talk to us more about the mayor's plan. We want to make sure that it includes, obviously, New Yorkers of all income. We want to make sure that it includes low-income New Yorkers as well as middle-income New Yorkers.
Well, Commissioner, I mean, we're very excited, I think, in the advocacy community, and very pleased, obviously, that Mayor Bloomberg came out with the first plan for actually coming up with low and moderate income housing construction. In recent memory, certainly. Can you tell us where it's at and how this is going to roll itself out?
Well, as both you and the council member have mentioned, in December of 2002, Mayor Bloomberg announced his $3 billion commitment to housing over the next 5 years, where we have plans to create at least 65,000 units of housing. About 38,000 of that will be towards preserving our current housing stock here in New York City. And the other of that will be in new construction. And for the new construction, it will represent about a 25% increase in new construction projects from over the last 5 years. So we're really pleased that the mayor has shown this commitment to housing. It will impact income groups from the very low income here in New York City to people earning middle-class wages. The way it breaks down now, and although these things may actually change, but right now we're expecting that about a third will go to low-income households, about a third of the dollars will be committed to moderate-income houses, and about a third to middle income.
In actual terms, how many units are we talking about?
We're talking about 65,000 units of housing.
So low income, you're talking about 19, 20,000 units or something?
A little more than 20,000.
I see.
About a third each.
Is the budget crisis going to be a major impediment to rolling this thing out?
Well, so far we think we'll be able to keep the commitment while we think we will be able to find savings by delaying a few of the slated projects, mainly the Gateway project, which has been slated for development in the Spring Creek section of Brooklyn.
Okay, and then is that lower moderate, or is it a mix?
That will be a mix.
Mixed use?
That'll be a mix,
okay.
In primary for home ownerships. But the mayor's commitment over the next 5 years, for the most part, will stay the same, the 65.
Now, when,
units.
for instance, we have, I think the administration just released the fact that it expects there to be 10,000 homeless families in the shelters by this summer. When will people in the city of New York begin to see these units coming on in a way that can affect what's going on in the city?
Well, David, we are working diligently. The kickoff date was really the next fiscal year, which, as you know, begins in July. However,
right.
We already have a good start. We have about 8,000 units in the pipeline towards that 65,000 number.
And in the pipeline means where?
In the pipeline means that we hope to close them over the next year between now and June of 2004.
And they'd be constructed?
They
or-
would be construction, depending on if it's a rehab or a new construction project, could take anywhere from 8 months to 18 months.
Okay, so it's
it's
not in
conceivable
the-
that we can see something in the next year. Next
That
year, this
actually
time,
starts to
that
deal with
actually
this.
starts to deal with the issue. Just
Right.
since you mentioned homeless housing, certainly one of the interesting parts of the mayor's housing plan, I think, really deals with the homeless component. Obviously, it's a huge crisis here in New York City, and the mayor has committed millions of dollars and has developed new programs to provide housing for low-income people and the homeless and just special needs group. So one of the groups that we are looking at are the children aging out of the foster care system.
Right. My favorite.
And we've have a few projects in the pipeline now for that group, but that is one of the
Well, I
groups
think you'll get a
amongst the
lot of
other
supporters.
homeless.
I mean, I
Yes.
was head of youth services for 3 or 4 years in the Koch administration. And at that point, though we weren't directly supervising it, the transition for a 16, 18-year-old in foster care was to give them $200 and a course on how to set up a bank book. And they were left on the streets. I think it was one of the most appalling forms of child abuse I've ever seen. Anyone who knows 18-year-olds who have no background to be thrown into an environment. The reason we have such a high correlation between incarceration and foster care, I mean, it doesn't take a genius to understand what went wrong here. And this isn't this administration's problem. This was a city problem that's never been addressed adequately.
Yeah, I'm listening, David, and I'm concerned only for the following reason. First of all, on the aging out, I think it's great that you're considering units.
Right.
But another agency, the Agency for Children's Services, even before the so-called doomsday contingency plan in the regular budget, and you may not know this, is talking about cuts to that group,
So, yeah.
to the aging out. And the preventive services contracts, which in fact assist that group, are being cut dramatically. And so, and then yesterday I co-chaired the Manhattan delegation, and we've had hearings for 3 days on groups in the neighborhoods that need funding. Right. And obviously those that deal with some of these human services come before us. And their preventive services contracts are being cut.
There is a real issue of collaboration and coordination between what government does. And this is not a Bloomberg problem. This was a Dinkins problem. This was a Koch problem.
Sure.
And the fact that there isn't a coordinated look about what happened to particularly poor children is really one of the glaring things that's left undone. And I think this is sort of a good example because I think the mayor is appropriately concerned with foster care. I think it's one of these are literally, if you have control of these kids, and yet we don't seem to do it right. I clearly think it's largely because they're the most politically vulnerable of all populations. They don't even have adults, a bit poor, who are fighting for them. They have nobody.
Well, clearly the mayor is recognizing the need in housing, and by dedicating funding in these times where funding really is so scarce, and obviously all of the agencies have been forced to make cuts that no one really wants to make.
Well, let's talk about the other side of the housing agenda, which is obviously the significant property tax increase that the council obviously supported of 18.5%, and obviously that's now rolling itself out. I assume the Rent Guidelines Board is at least in part a reflection of that. How do we try to ameliorate impacts on poor children, poor families?
Well, a
What is
couple
the
of things.
discussion?
First of all, in my city council, there are people obviously from all 5 boroughs. And I feel that it is particularly a concern for Queens and Brooklyn and Staten Island, where homeowners exist in more numbers than in Manhattan, for instance, and where they actually get the bill. You know, if you're a co-op or you're rental, you don't actually see the bill. It obviously becomes part of your rent in some cases, or your maintenance as a shareholder. But the fact of the matter is, one of the concerns is those individuals who are older, their children have moved on, they've paid their mortgage, and yet they're on a fixed income. And so they're going to see this large property tax. We're going to try to deal with it with Albany. Obviously,
Right.
we have a new Albany budget, we think.
Right.
We're not sure yet,
Mm-hmm.
depending on the override. But that there's some new taxes, obviously. One of them is what we call the absentee landlord.
tax.
And hopefully some of that revenue, we're hoping, could in fact assist some of these individuals.
We've also
that I just described.
been working and through Community Service Society on the effort to get a state circuit breaker, which would allow particularly elderly, that already exists, but a very small amount, and those people with very low income to get some exemption off this thing, not have imposition of this. This is an idea that's clearly been floating around a lot. It obviously, people get concerned about it, but I think we're going to need some way, because essentially we're bailing out the ocean, even as the units you talk about, if we have this real fast ramp up in people who can't afford anything. I mean, we can run as fast as we can, and we're not going to get anywhere. One of the things I'd like to close this segment with, what is the federal role here? Section 8 disappearing clearly is part of the difficulty we've been under. I mean, part of the Koch plan that built so many units was built on a real deep federal subsidy. How do we go through without some federal participation here?
Well, we actually do have federal participation. I think we've been able to, at HPD, we've been able to aggressively apply for a number of grants available from HUD for funding through their economic development initiatives.
And that's to construction. That's not the
that's-
deep subsidy programs
That's
going
to
forward.
construction. There are some issues with Section 8, and I think the city will aggressively attempt to get as many Section 8 vouchers as we can provide. We are actually looking at providing Section 8 vouchers to home ownership projects, so that people that are eligible for Section 8 can actually own their own homes as opposed to just renting. So the federal government is showing some flexibility to allow us to obtain Section 8.
Yeah, I'd like to, if you have a position for the administration, also know what their thoughts are on the dividend tax cut that's being proposed by the president, which theoretically could have a particularly major impact on us.
Well, I think the mayor has said that he's working with Congressman Rangel, the head of the New York delegation, in supporting anything that would keep the low-income tax credit available here for New Yorkers, because certainly the low-income tax credit has been just extremely instrumental in building affordable housing units for low-income New Yorkers here. So I think the mayor's been very clear on that.
We'll be right back to continue the urban agenda.
Good evening. Follow me, please.
Imagine what America would be like today if Martin Luther King never had a dream. Help keep the dream alive. To find out more about the Martin Luther King Memorial in Washington, D.C., call or log on now.
We're talking with City Council member Gale Brewer and Kim Hardy, Deputy Commissioner in the Department of Housing Preservation and Development. Gale, let's talk about something that I think is close to both our hearts, which is the question of affordable housing and homelessness, and how you see this all playing out in the city.
Well, a couple of things. First of all, I think the mayor's plan is a good one, but I do think there should be more units for the homeless. And I know that there are some. One suggestion would be to, HPD, in order to put this plan together, did cut some of its own capital plan. They have money from other sources, the Housing Development Corporation and so on. So we would like to see more of dollars go into this plan that comes from the HPD capital plan, and hopefully use some of that for low income. I did spend the night the other day at the Emergency Assistance Unit, which is in the Bronx, and it was packed. There was no room to sit. And that, unfortunately, is the purview of the Commissioner, Linda Gibbs, who's trying very hard at homeless services. That's a housing problem. It's other kinds of challenges that individuals have, but I think it's primarily a housing problem. So the question is, what do you do about it? I would like to see a little bit more preservation. Again, back to my theme. To the credit of the Commissioner, just yesterday, she had a meeting with different agencies, nonprofits and city agencies, including HPD, to try to figure out how to do this. And what are some suggestions for keeping people in their homes, be it, without being technical in the terms, figuring out ways of paying some rent, social services, whatever it takes. Again, coordination of different agencies. So the homeless problem is huge. So that's one suggestion. She also has, for the homeless population, some Section 8 vouchers. I think she had around 9,000 Section 8 vouchers. She told us at a hearing that she wasn't able to use them all, and they did revert back to NYCHA, to the New York City Housing Authority, and I'm sure they used them. But the issue is, how do you, again, coordination. You've got perhaps some units that might be available in some HPD buildings, I don't know. You've got some vouchers, you've got some owners who won't take Section 8 vouchers, I'm sure.
Right.
But how do we work as a city, coordinated with nonprofits and city agencies, for instance, to use all 9,000 of those vouchers?
You know, it's true. My social workers, we have one of the last reserves of cash that we essentially use with people who meet certain criteria to pay back rent. And it's generally a short-term problem. Either someone loses a job and is in the process of getting new work, or is transitioning from welfare, to work. But we don't have much money. We have about $500,000 or so that we use. The trouble is, as I talk to my social workers, the demand has become so huge that literally we close down admission to this program within minutes. I mean, we open it up at the beginning of each month and it's out. The money flies out. So that's not the way. This has to be a coordinated activity between not-for-profits and particularly government, because this is beyond the capacity of obviously the not-for-profit sector.
Sure, as the council member just mentioned, I think there has been coordination as much as possible between HPD and other city agencies, notably the Department of Homeless Services, and certainly, again, the mayor is certainly committed to trying to solve the homeless problem, and that indeed I think will take coordination with not just government, but with the various nonprofits that are really the experts on this. And we do think that increasing the housing production for homeless families will help to give permanent housing for people, not just a transitional housing, although some transitional housing is needed as well. And really one of the problems that we've encountered lately is that in a number of communities it's been very difficult for us to site permanent housing facilities for the low income and homeless populations, and we've had a few projects that have been met with opposition, even unfortunately in the council.
Right.
I think those are isolated cases.
No, I think that's an issue. But again, it's back to what David said. We have to have a different approach, because up to now it is understandably been, let's put the folks into the building in some cases. Like in my district, some individuals who are homeless came in. I would have preferred a little bit more lead time, figure out a different agency to be the support services. It needs a different approach.
Well, I think that might,
well,
I guess for the HPD siting, which is really all I could speak to, in that instance we typically get community board approval before we give the nonprofit the go-ahead to have a supportive housing project. But what happens in a couple of recent cases, we've actually had the community board reverse itself 2 years later after the group has expended
clearly the NIMBY problem is all over the place.
Right,
but
of course.
We have supported in Washington Heights one of the better supported SROs, Broadway Housing. And their approach, obviously, is one that can gain community support because they've really put in an infrastructure of social supports. I think what communities are afraid of are you going to create scatter site housing with no support for families.
Right, of course.
And it doesn't mean every scatter site person has trouble, but there are troubled families. And if you don't support them, you're essentially pushing problems into already reeling communities. And I think this now, because of what we are certain is going to be a sharp rise in crime, is going to set up these kinds of resistance where it shouldn't be happening.
Right, that's exactly right.
The
And I think we really have to work together to show there are those supportive services in place.
The director of Common Ground testified the other day, and she said very articulately, we were talking just about this issue, citing, and she said, it takes time. She said, we do it the long way. We go and meet with the community, we discuss what we're going to do, we talk about when we purchased the building, but we don't do anything until we've had the community discuss after that point. She said, it takes a lot of resources.
That's exactly right.
But in the end, it pays off.
Another thing that's going to hit us, and it's really neither of yours immediate portfolio, we are going to have 40,000 people coming out of the criminal justice system on parole that are going to hit only 7 New York City communities.
Sure.
Not a clue of how we're going to house, not to mention the crime thing, but house, feed, and provide some job opportunities to them. We have a sort of perfect storm of things that are going to be impacting poor communities, and basically, I don't get the sense of urgency. I think we know about it. Part of the reason we obviously do this program is to start, wait a minute, this is some serious stuff. We're seeing 24% unemployment rates among Black and Latino youth in Bedford-Stuyvesant and Crown Heights. And then I'm getting this other population coming in who are severely disabled in their own way in terms of their ability to earn and find housing. And we have quite a thing in front of us. Okay, enough grim stuff.
Right.
How should we go about going forward? I know that in the mayor's plan there's some other things that are being talked about to try to alleviate the housing crisis that you're working on, Kim.
Sure. Well, I think one of the I think more exciting aspects and something really new is that the mayor is dedicated monies and energies of really a coordinated approach from the Department of City Planning and HPD, the Department of Environmental Protection, mainly through Deputy Mayor Dan Doctoroff's office, to try to rezone some of the underutilized areas, namely the waterfront, some brownfield areas, other manufacturing areas that are really no longer being used, to rezone them for housing uses, for residential uses, to help us try to build more housing, to provide, and then to provide some financial incentives to have developers come in and build affordable housing.
Now, what about Mitchell Lamas? We haven't, essentially I focus on the very poor, but clearly there's another crisis brewing that's going to hit moderate as well as poor, and that's the Mitchell Lama crisis.
Right, and David, the Mitchell Lamas, you should know, I have 21 Mitchell Lamas in my district, more than any other council district, and I was at a Mitchell Lama meeting last night. Their Mitchell Lamas have different kinds of financing, and some of them actually have housing authority units in them. So we should be clear that it's often the poor as well as middle income. And this is a crisis because after 20 years, these owners can buy out the mortgage, and then in some cases, the tenants, or at that point, the tenants, in some cases, I suppose, co-ops, because there are also co-ops that are Mitchell Lamas, they can, in fact, go into rent stabilization. There's a but. Depends on when the building was built. And the other problem is that obviously once that unit becomes rent stabilized, that tenant may be okay, but as a policymaker for the future, we lose the affordable unit. So there are tremendous discussions. Some tenants get what's known as a sticky voucher, which is a Section 8 voucher for a higher income individual. For a single person, for instance, you can make $41,000 and get the voucher. But again, that voucher is as long as you are living in that apartment. On the west side, that kind of, two-family, two-unit, two-bedroom apartment is going to go for a great deal of money when you either move or, God forbid, pass on. It's a crisis. It's a crisis.
It is a crisis.
I think obviously everyone's concerned about the Mitchell Lama buyouts. I guess the first point I would make is that, certainly the council member knows this, but while it really is impacting the city actually doesn't have control over it, since it's state legislation that determined basically the rules of the game with regard to the 20-year opt-out to buy. Having said that, I think people are looking at the issue as part of the mayor's housing plan. He has put together a neighborhood advisory panel comprised mainly, of housing professionals. One of the committees is actually looking at this issue to see what we can do to try to preserve these affordable units that are in Mitchell Lama. So we are trying to study it. And
we're obviously part, on the periphery of a group studying whether the council has a role, but also obviously the mayor taking a stand-up position on this with the legislature, talking. This is a bridge issue. I see them only occasionally. In healthcare, I see it, but in housing, the fact that Mitchell Lama takes in moderate, some middle, and low means that the political clout here is just enormous.
Oh, sure.
And if we could get the mayor actively engaged in this, I think there is stuff that can be done.
Well, I think the mayor has appointed these housing professionals
Right.
to look at this issue, and I think he will await for some sort of recommendation.
Again, it's a
Gale,
coordination.
final word.
From them,
Again,
but-
it's absolutely going on, but there's a coordination problem. Obviously, it's a state issue, but it's also a HUD issue, and it's an
course,
HPD
of
issue.
course,
And we just met with
course.
HUD, and sometimes HUD says it's HPD, and sometimes HPD says it's HUD, just on warehousing.
Right, it just depends on what
Some of
the buildings
some
are
of these
controlled by
Mitchell-Lamas have
HPD, some by
huge
HUD.
warehousing issues,
Right.
and we'd like to have those warehousing stop. These are affordable units right now, and they're holding them open so that when they buy out, they
They'll
have a
make a lot of
unit
money.
that they can
We
make
are
some unit
very
on.
concerned about the warehousing
Right.
issue because obviously these owners are supposed to rent up.
Right.
And they cannot
not.
warehouse. And I think we're finding, I mean, not to cast blame to
No,
another
go ahead.
agency, but certainly we have an enforcement mechanism at HPD for the ones that are under city control. And I would hope that we would not find warehousing in the ones that are under city control.
My thanks to City Council member Gale Brewer and Kim Hardy, Deputy Commissioner in the Department of Housing Preservation and Development. Affordable housing continues to be a core crisis issue for poor and working poor New Yorkers. It is a priority item for CSS and demands significant attention by all levels of government, city, state, and federal. Nothing less is appropriate to address this critical problem. I'm David R. Jones of the Community Service Society. Thank you for watching the Urban Agenda.
To comment on the Urban Agenda or for more information on CSS, contact Community Service Society of New York, 105 East 22nd Street, New York, New York, 10010. Area code 212-254-8900.